Dream Children, a Reverie by Charles Lamb. Let's talk about the complete essay in English. Children love to listen to stories about their elders. Children like to listen to the stories about the elders. Elders means here he is talking referring to grandparents or great grandparents because they want to stretch their imagination. Here also they have talked about great uncle or grandame whom they never saw. It was in this spirit that my little ones crept about me the other evening to hear about their great grandmother Field. So here Charles Lamb is talking about that their great grandmother, whose name was Field, they want to know about her, who lived in a great house in Norfolk. Its area, and here there was a big house, and their great grandmother was living here, and 100 times bigger than that in which they and Papa lived, which had been the scene, because the house they themselves were living that was very small, and this great house was 100 times bigger. So at least it was generally believed in that part of the country of the tragic incidents, and in that big house some incidents, tragic incidents happened and lately become familiar with from the ballad of the children in the wood. From this ballad they come to know about the tragic incidents. Certain it is that the whole story of the children and their cruel uncle was to be seen fairly carved out in wood upon the chimney piece of the great hall. In the great hall, on the chimney piece, the story of cruel uncle who killed two infants, children, and their story was there, and that was the tragic incident of the great house mansion in which their great grandmother Field was living. The whole story down to the robin redbreasts till a foolish rich person pulled it down to set up a marble one of modern invention in its stead, with no story upon it. But later on, the story of the children who were killed by their cruel uncle, that was replaced by a marble which was already on wooden, and it was carved there, and there was no story now on this marble. Here Alice put out one of her dear mother's looks, too tender to be called upbraiding. Now after listening to that, as Charles Lamb is telling about that it was replaced and there was no story on the marble, she gives some reaction as mother's looks, and Charles Lamb is reminded of her mother, means his would-be wife. Then I went on to say how religious and how good their great grandmother Field was, how beloved and respected by everybody. This is Field, this was great grandmother of the children, and she was highly religious and highly respected, and she was beloved of everybody. Though she was not indeed the mistress of this great house, the house we are talking about, the mansion, she was not the owner, but had only the charge of it. She was managing this, and yet in some respects she might be said to be the mistress of it too, because she was managing, she had the full power to manage, and we can say she was the mistress committed to her by the owner, because owner had given her full power to manage this big house, who preferred living in a newer and more fashionable mansion which he had purchased somewhere in the adjoining county. The real owner of the old house shifted to a newer house. It was more fashionable mansion which he had purchased, and it was in the adjoining area, county. But still she lived in it in a manner as if it had been her own. Great grandmother Field was living in old house as it was her own, and kept up the dignity of the great house in a short while she lived. which afterward came to decay. For the time being, she was alive and she maintained the dignity of this big old house, but after her death, it came to decay. It starts declining, falling, and was nearly pulled down, and all its old ornaments stripped and carried away to the owner's other house where they were set up. And as old house decayed and many of its ornaments were taken to the new house where the real owner was living, and looked as awkward as if someone were to carry away the old tombs they had seen lately at the abbey and stick them up in Lady C's tawdry gilt drawing room, as something we take from the tomb, from the abbey, and we bring in some house. It was just like this, because from old house they brought the things in the new house which were looking very awkward. Here John smiled as much as to say that would be foolish indeed. And John, whom Charles Lamb is telling the story, he gives the reaction that really it was a foolish action to shift the ornaments or the things from old house to new house. And then I told how when she came to die, her funeral was attended by a concourse of all the poor and some of the gentry too. Talking about Field, when she died, so at her funeral, many who were poor, who were rich, of the neighborhood for many miles around, from very distant places also, to show their respect for her memory, because she was very gentle, respected lady, because she had been such a good and religious woman, so good indeed that she knew all the psaltery by heart, I and a great part of the Testament besides. Here Charles Lamb is telling about she was a religious woman. She knew the psaltery, means all the hymns of the Bible by heart. She knew a lot about testaments also. Here little Alice spread her hands. Then I told what a tall, upright, graceful person their great grandmother Field once was. Here Lamb talks about Field. When she was young, she was tall, upright, and very graceful person. And how in her youth she was esteemed the best dancer. When she was young, she was the best dancer. Here Alice's little right foot played an involuntary movement, till upon my looking grave it desisted. Then Lamb talks about that I looked her at gravely, because she was giving the reaction. The best dancer, I was saying. Lamb says that I told that best dancer in the county, till a cruel disease called a cancer came and bowed her down with pain. She was detected with cancer, that is a very cruel disease, and that bowed her down with pain, because it's a very painful disease. But it could never bend her good spirits or make them stoop, but they were still upright, because she was so good and religious. She was very good lady, religious lady. Despite pain of cancer, she never bent her good spirits. Then I told how she was used to sleep by herself in a lone chamber of the great lone house, because it was a big house, mansion, and she used to sleep alone, because she used to live alone in this mansion. And how she believed that an apparition of two infants was to be seen at midnight gliding up and down the great staircase near where she slept. As she used to live alone in this big house, so there were the apparition, means ghost of two infants. Here you can see in the image, so was to be seen at midnight gliding up and down the great staircase near where she slept, where she used to sleep. But She said those innocents would do her no harm. She had the faith that they won't cause any harm to her because she was a religious lady. And how frightened I used to be, though in those days I had my maid to sleep with me. Here, Charles Lamb is talking about that the maid used to sleep with me, and even then I was frightened because I was never half so good or religious as she, and yet I never saw the infants. Here, Charles Lamb says that I never saw the infants because of the impact of field because she was very religious. Here, John expanded all his eyebrows and tried to look courageous. Then I told how good she was to all her grandchildren. Field was very good towards all grandchildren. Having us to the great house in the holidays, where I in particular used to spend my hours by myself. Here Lambs tells that in his holidays when he was a child, he used to spend his many hours himself there in the mansion. In gazing upon the old busts of the 12 Caesars that had been emperors of Rome, one thing he used to look at the busts of 12 Caesars, means emperors of Rome, till the old marble heads would seem to live again, or I to be turned into marble with them. He used to find his similarity with those Caesars, means with those emperors of Rome. Either they should be alive like him or he should be like them in marble. How I never could be tired with roaming about that huge mansion, with its vast empty rooms, with their worn out hangings, fluttering tapestry, and carved oaken panels, with the gilding almost rubbed out. So here talks about there were very big and empty rooms, and there were worn out hangings, means curtains, fluttering tapestry on the tables, the clothes were laid, and carved oaken panels of oak tree, carved wooden panels were there, and gilding almost rubbed out because it was old mansion and everything was almost rubbed out. Sometimes in the spacious old fashioned gardens which I had almost to myself, unless when now and then a solitary gardening man would cross me. Then he talks about that there were big gardens, fashioned gardens, only gardening men used to come, otherwise nobody was around, and Charles Lamb used to enjoy the full scene, that garden scene. And how the nectarines and peaches hang upon the walls without my ever offering to pluck them because they were forbidden fruit unless now and then. Then he talks about that there were nectarines and peaches growing upon the walls. He was not allowed to pluck them, but he used to enjoy looking at them. And because I had more pleasure in strolling about among the old melancholy looking yew trees or the firs or picking up the red berries. He says that melancholy like means sad looking yew trees, fir trees, or picking up the red berries. He gives the reference to these. And the fir apples which were good for nothing but to look at, or in lying about upon the fresh grass with all the fine garden smells around me. First, he talks about fir apples, just they couldn't be eaten, that's why he says that good for nothing but to look at. For looking, they were good at. And then he talks about the fresh grass which was in the garden, and he used to enjoy the smell around it. Or basking in the orangery. There were oranges, and he used to bask till I could almost fancy myself ripening too along with the oranges and the limes in that grateful warmth. So here there were limes, means lemons, oranges, and he used to enjoy the complete scene, or in watching the days that darted to and fro in the fish pond. Then he gives reference to the fish pond, and there was a fish days that darted, means swimming from side to side, at the bottom of the garden, and with here and there a great sulky pike, another reference to another fish, hanging midway down the water in silent state, as if it mocked at their impertinent friskings. Means he's talking about these two types of fish and how they were swimming and enjoying in the fish pond. I had more pleasure in these busy, idle diversions than in all the sweet flavors of peaches, nectarines, oranges, and such like common baits of children. Because children really enjoy these all things, and he also enjoyed the complete here garden where many things were growing. Here, John slyly deposited back upon the plate a bunch of grapes, which, not unobserved by Alice, he had meditated dividing with her. So now, here Lamb is talking about the present because he is telling the story of the past, but here he sees John and Alice have started talking about eating, snatching the grapes which is kept before them, and both seemed willing to relinquish them for the present as irrelevant. So then they show that they don't desire, they want to relinquish this grapes also, because they find it irrelevant in comparison to the past things, anecdotes Charles Lamb is sharing with them. Then, in somewhat a more heightened tone, I told how, though their great grandmother Field loved all her grandchildren. Lamb further talks about the way great grandmother used to love them all. Yet, in an especial manner, she might be said to love their uncle, John L., because he was so handsome and spirited a youth and a king to the rest of us. John uncle was like a king. He was spirited, full of energy. He was very handsome, and great grandmother Field used to like him the best. And instead of moping about in solitary corners like some of us, he would mount the most mettlesome horse he could get. Here, talking about Uncle John, and he could mount, he could ride the horse, and he was very courageous. He is talking about when, but an important no bigger than themselves, and make it carry him half over the county in a morning and join the hunters when there were any out. So he used to enjoy the hunting, riding, every action that one could think of in this age. And yet he loved the old great house and gardens too, but had too much spirit to be always pent up within their boundaries. He used to enjoy that old mansion also, but he used to enjoy many things outside that mansion also. And how their uncle grew up to man's state, as brave as he was handsome, to the admiration of everybody, but of their great grandmother Field most especially. He is talking about the bond that there was between Uncle John and great grandmother Field, and how he used to carry me upon his back when I was a lame footed boy, for he was a good bit older than me. Here, Charles Lamb is talking about that his brother used to help him when he himself was lame footed, and his brother John used to help him many a mile when I could not walk for pain, and how in after life he became lame footed too. Now, Charles Lamb talks about that his elder brother John also became, in later stage of life, lame footed as earlier he himself was. And I did not always, I fear, make allowances enough for him when he was impatient and in pain, nor remember sufficiently how considerate he had been to me when I was lame footed. When I was lame footed, Charles Lamb talks about, he always helped me. But when he became lame footed, I could not help him. And how, when he died, though he had not been dead an hour, it seemed as if he had died a great while ago. Such a distance there is betwixt life and death. Then he talks about the death of John. When he died, just only 1 hour passed, but it seemed to Charles Lamb that a long time had passed and such a great distance. He says that that is the difference between life and death, and how I bore his death as I thought pretty well at first, but afterward it haunted and haunted me. He says, in the beginning, when he died, initially I felt that it's good, no problem, he has died. But later on, it always haunted me because when anything goes missing, when there is not that thing, we start feeling the need for it because he always helped Charles Lamb. That's why Charles Lamb feels the need for his elder brother. And though I did not cry or take it to heart as some do, and as I think he would have done if I had died, yet I missed him all day long. Here Lamb is talking about that I didn't cry or take it to my heart as some people do, and my brother would have felt my absence in more serious way than I did, and knew not till then how much I had loved him. I missed his kindness and I missed his crossness and wished him to be alive again, to be quarreling with him, for we quarreled sometimes. He talks about his relation. He had good and bad relations, but they used to quarrel and he used to relish all those moments with him, and that's why he is missing him now rather than not have him again, and was an uneasy without him as he their poor uncle must have been when the doctor took off his limb. Here Lamb talks about that during the last days of his life, because he was lame footed, his limb was taken off. Here the children fell a crying and asked if their little mourning which they had on was not for Uncle John. Because after listening to this, as Lamb talks about that his limb was taken off, now the children request, and they looked up and prayed me not to go on about their uncle. They say that now don't tell us about the uncle, but to tell them some stories about their pretty dead mother. They want to know something about their mother. Then I told them how for 7 long years, in hope sometimes, sometimes in despair, yet persisting ever, I quoted the fair Alice W.N. Here Charles Lamb talks about that for 7 years he was in love with their mother Alice to marry her. And as much as children could understand, I explained to them what coyness and difficulty and denial meant in maidens. Now Lamb says, because children as much as they could understand that when a girl shies and how much it is difficult for a girl, for the maidens, how do they deny the all things about these things, he shares as per the level of understanding of his children. When suddenly turning to Alice, the soul of the first Alice looked out at her eyes with such a reality of representment. Here Charles Lamb talks about when he looked at Alice, his daughter, he felt her mother, first Alice, because in her eyes he felt that it was his wife, and such a reality of representment, it confused Charles Lamb, that I became in doubt which of them stood there before me. Who was there? His daughter or his wife? Or whose that bright hair was? His daughter's or wife's? And while I stood gazing, he kept looking at her. Both the children gradually grew fainter to my view, receding and still receding till nothing at last but two mournful features were seen in the uttermost distance. He says that their presence means his children, John and Alice, they started to become fainter, dim, and they started receding, disappearing, and at last nothing was except mournful features, which, without speech, strangely impressed upon me the effects of speech. We are not of Alice, nor of thee, nor are we children at all. And he felt the voices as they were saying that we are not of Alice, we are not your children, nor are we children at all. We are not children at all. The children of Alice call Bartram father, and he tells that those children call Bartram as their father, not to Charles Lamb. We are nothing, less than nothing, and dreams. Those children, those voices were there that they said, we are nothing, less than nothing, just dreams. We are only what might have been, and must wait upon the tedious shores of Lethe millions of ages before we have existence and a name. Before having any existence or name, millions of ages it would take after going through the process of mythological river Lethe. And immediately awaking, I found myself quietly seated in my bachelor armchair. Here Charles Lamb talks about that I found myself seated in my bachelor armchair where I had fallen asleep, because he was asleep and this was all his dream with the faithful Bridget. Bridget, it's a reference to his sister who was Mary Lamb in real life. He used to live with her, unchanged by my side, and John L. or James Elia was gone forever. And he talks about with that name James Elia, Charles Lamb, or he was talking about John L. They all disappeared for forever. Thank you.